today. My name is Alexa Trolley Hansen, and I'm a doctoral student at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University and the moderator for today's Making Sense of Employment Research webinar. The webinar is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. The webinar content does not represent the views or policies of the funding agency, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. I'd also like to state that the webinar content does not represent the views or policies of the funding agency, and you should not assume any endorsement by the federal government, which I already said once. Sorry about that. The territory that BU stands on is that of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, and we honor and respect the history and current efforts of Native Indigenous communities. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is on, and the webinar recording will be available on the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation's website approximately a week to 2 weeks after this webinar is completed. You will be muted during the presentation, but we are going to have a question and answer session at the end. If you have a question during the presentation, please post your questions in the chat box, and I will give you permission to ask them at the end. And also, I'd really appreciate your feedback about this webinar, so I will be posting a survey in the chat at the end of the session. If you have any questions during the session, if you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to me via the chat feature. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Susan McGurk, who is presenting research from her article, Comparison of Black and White Participants with Severe Mental Illness in Response to Cognitive Remediation as an Augmentation of Vocational Rehabilitation. Dr. McGurk is a trained neuropsychologist and professor in the departments of occupational therapy and psychological brain sciences at Boston University. She is the director of cognitive remediation initiatives at BU's Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, where she studies cognitive remediation methods to promote employment, academic pursuits, and independent living in persons with severe mental illnesses. Dr. McGurk, thank you. Welcome. We are so excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Alexa. And thank you, Amanda, for inviting me and helping me set up. So again, my name is Susan McGurk, and I'm presenting a paper that addresses the question, does race influence response to cognitive remediation in people with serious mental illnesses? So I think most of us here are aware that there are disparities in health outcomes between Black and white service users with serious mental illnesses. For example, Black service users have shown less improvement than white service users in aspects of illnesses, including symptoms and functioning following discharge from an inpatient stay, despite similar ratings on these domains. That's just one example of a disparity. Mental health systems do not successfully engage into care people of color to the same extent as white people. For example, Black people diagnosed with schizophrenia have shown to have lower utilization rates for voluntary mental health services than white people. And one of the postulations for this inequity in access and enrollment is that lower service use may be related to stigmatizing and discriminatory experiences for Black adults with mental illness. So people are not always getting satisfactory care. And there are other barriers that have been identified by researchers in the field, including financial issues. There's also evidence of lower treatment gains for service users of color, even accounting for the services that are used. But the results are inconsistent. So for example, findings, a review by Bond et al. And another study by Perkins et al. Bond in particular reviewed the evidence of outcomes in supported employment that Black versus white clients benefit equally. And we certainly think that has something to do with the zero exclusion aspect of supported employment. But it's an important question whether psychosocial treatments for people with serious mental illness have comparable effectiveness for Black versus white clients diagnosed with schizophrenia. Race, ethnicity, and cultural factors have not typically been systematically integrated into the development and evaluation of evidence-based interventions for people with schizophrenia. And my field or my research area has been cognitive enhancement for people with serious mental illnesses, and whether race influences response to these services has not been systematically evaluated. So the question, are Black participants similarly engaged in the cognitive remediation program, and in particular, thinking skills for work as white participants? Secondly, do Black versus white participants show similar benefits in terms of cognitive and vocational outcomes, which are focused on in our studies of thinking skills for work? The primary author is, I just want to point this out, is Nicole Detour, and Nikkei, Balogun, Mwangi are really credited with this paper. So just a little bit of background about why we have developed, tested, and implemented a cognitive enhancement program for people with serious mental illnesses. Well, we know that cognitive challenges are common in people with SMI, and that these cognitive problems are related to a broad range of difficulties, including problems with self-care, independent living, social relationships, and employment. And cognitive impairments are predictive of diminished profit from rehabilitation, including, for example, social skills training and supported employment. So these are important targets. So, and in terms of supported employment, it is an evidence-based practice that is the most effective vocational rehabilitation program for improving work. But there's a subgroup of people who do not receive the full benefits of this intervention, as evidenced by either working very little, losing a job despite receipt of these services, or people don't work at all in these programs. And it turns out cognitive functioning predicts employment outcomes in people with serious mental illness, including people receiving this evidence-based practice. So in some people, cognitive difficulties overwhelm these good services. Some evidence or indication of cognitive problems on the job include, but aren't necessarily limited to, slowness, problems with the quality of work, forgetting steps of a task or tasks altogether, difficulties with problem solving, lower stamina, problems with fatigue. Again, something we always recognize in people with traumatic brain injury, stamina and fatigue in particular, but have been slow to recognize these issues in people with SMI and to help accommodate those. Lateness and absenteeism, problems paying attention, and disorganization often reflect some cognitive compromise. So what is the Thinking Skills for Work program? Well, this cognitive enhancement program provides comprehensive cognitive services that are integrated with vocational services. They are implemented by a cognitive specialist who can be an employment specialist and who is a member of the supported employment team. This person provides follow-along cognitive consultation and support to address any cognitive challenges in finding and keeping work. And in general, the intervention requires 6 to 12 months to complete. So the overarching goals of Thinking Skills for Work are to help improve cognitive abilities, to enhance a person's confidence in their cognition, and to reduce negative thinking about cognitive capacity, cognitive skills, and also about their ability to work, and to optimize getting and keeping competitive jobs. So the outcomes of our studies and of our clinical implementations are twofold: improve cognition and improve work. We've published our our book, Cognitive Remediation for Successful Employment and Psychiatric Recovery. So this is basically a very enhanced model of what we do. So some of the methods and the guiding principles I'll briefly describe here are described in detail in the book, and in particular, all the methods for implementing thinking skills for work. So how does it work? Well, as I said, it's delivered by a cognitive and employment specialist. An assessment is done to help understand what the cognitive contributions may have been to a recent or remote job loss, and that's looked at very closely. It's called a job loss analysis. And sometimes a ride along is done in the community if more information is needed about how cognition might be a barrier to getting a job and or keeping it. Cognitive enhancement approaches include computer cognitive training and cognitive self-management strategies. And the way the program is delivered is tailored to the client needs and the client's desires, and based on the results of the assessment. So just to give you an example, for some of you I know who are on our certified cognitive specialist, and will be surprised to see this maze. So other of you who haven't seen a cognitive exercise, I'm just going to show this for a minute. This is called a labyrinth from CogPack software. We've used CogPack. Other software is also available to use in a cognitive enhancement program. Anyway, the goal of this task is to solve a problem, and that is start on the left side and get out on the right side as fast as possible, avoiding blind alleys. This is an example of how someone may solve this maze. So what a cognitive specialist might do is do a print screen on this solution and ask the client to point out where there might have been mistakes in planning ahead. And so that would be anytime a person went down a blind alley, for example. And then they'll collaborate in terms of avoiding those errors the next time they do it. So there's where an indication of where these planning failures occurred. And then some discussion and trial and practice of a strategy. For example, solving it first with your eyes, or solving it halfway and putting your finger there, whatever helps the client improve their performance. So you can see less mistakes were made, and it was solved much more quickly. This is an example of a group-based cognitive remediation program where you have a cognitive specialist who can work with a few clients at a time who are working on exercises. So that's an example of computer cognitive training. The other component of thinking skills for work are cognitive self-management strategies, which are tools aimed at reducing problems related to cognitive limitations or excessive cognitive demands that happen at work. For example, sometimes people refer to these as compensatory strategies, but I don't think they are. They actually have been shown to improve cognitive functioning and optimize people's functioning. And all of us use them all of the time, whether we're aware of it or not. Clients use them too. And we do this in our assessment to determine if they're using them to their best advantage, or if there are other strategies that they can be taught and use in their work search, for example. So the primary goal is to extend cognitive performance. As I said, everyone uses these types of strategies: alarms, to-do lists, prioritizing our day. One example is a memory spot, and this solves a bunch of problems. So you put like a basket in your front hallway when you come in your apartment or your house, and you throw everything in there that you don't need in your house: your car keys, your work ID, wallet or purse. And then you don't have to think about where it is when it's time to leave the house. So it obviates the need for memory. And it can be very helpful. So the cognitive self-management strategies cover motivational aspects. For example, understanding the relationship between cognition and work, recognizing your strengths. That's very important for people to really have a systematic review of everything they have going for them. Personal resources, skills, certifications, experience, education, etc. And this is very helpful to do prior to a job interview, for example, and challenging negative self-thinking. We realized early on that there was quite a bit of this, and it's very helpful to teach clients to recognize when they're having a negative self-thought and to teach them to challenge that thought. Something like cognitive behavioral therapy, but on a very limited scale. And then the strategies that deal with very practical aspects of cognition, for example, getting organized for your job search, solving problems, improving attention and concentration. And the people who we have enrolled in our studies and other clinical implementations of thinking skills for work include people who have specific goals, but have had difficulty achieving them, work or school goals, despite getting good services for those, or people who are newly enrolled in, say, a vocational rehabilitation program, but have obvious cognitive difficulties. So for this current study, what we did is pull data from 5 randomized controlled studies of thinking skills for work. In these studies, schizophrenia is the most common diagnosis, but keep in mind, we worked at agencies that include people with serious mental illness, and that's who we included. So although the majority of people have schizophrenia, there are people with mood disorders as well, and anxiety disorders. Our follow-up periods for our studies are up to 36 months. And overall, all these studies found greater improvements in cognition and work in people who got VR enhanced with thinking skills for work compared to vocational rehabilitation alone. So here's more information than you wanted. These are data from our 5 studies, and I'm showing them to you so you know that our racial inclusion differed depending on where the study is done. So it reflects the demographics of the area. So our studies in Brooklyn and New York have differentially greater numbers of Black participants than white participants, as opposed to our R01, which was the Manchester and Chicago, with most of our subjects being enrolled in Manchester, New Hampshire, and the demographics primarily reflect white participants. Yeah, so as I said, the majority of participants have schizophrenia. So all these studies are published, with the exception of our thinking skills and IMR, but that's on its way. So this is just a bar graph of our vocational outcomes. And you can see that overall, in the orange bar reflects our cognitive enhancement plus vocational rehabilitation has significantly more competitive work than VR alone, which is in blue. And there's an extra study here in this bar graph, then we include it in our RCTs. This was a smaller study that focused a little more on internships, so we didn't include it in the study I'm presenting. So just briefly, we looked at engagement in services, retention in services. We looked at repeated measures and ANOVAs to compare our two primary racial groups. We did exclude Latinx participants because we did not have sufficient numbers to analyze that group of participants alone. So they were excluded from our subject totals and excluded from the analysis. yeah, so I am going to review all these approaches and the findings. Okay, so overall, you can see, I need to move this a little so I can see this slide. All right, 119 Black participants compared to 121 white participants. So we really had about equal numbers and of Black versus white participants. We're looking here at significant, at important demographics that we report in our studies. And more importantly, are the ones that we found differences in. So for people who completed high school, you can see that our Black participants were less likely to have completed high school, significantly less likely than our white participants. That is a significant racial difference. Another one is amount of competitive work in the past 5 years. And we define that by 12 months of 12 consecutive months of competitive employment. That significantly differed with Black participants being less likely to have that amount of competitive work. And in addition, we found that Black participants were more likely to be diagnosed with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder compared to white participants. Those three areas differed significantly amongst the participants. Nothing else did. Okay. So then one of the questions we were looking at is exposure, engagement exposure. So we define exposure to thinking skills for work. And again, that is comprised of computer cognitive training and self-management strategies. We define exposure by having received at least 6 sessions of computer cognitive training. And the way our computer cognitive training is structured is we aim for 24 sessions. The first six sessions, about an hour each, something like approximately 10 exercises per session. And having done 6 exposes the person to the broad array of practice. I showed you the mazes. That's an example of problem solving, but we have memory, thinking speed, attention. And those first 6 sessions give a good exposure to all domains of practice. So what we found in terms of exposure, which is one of the issues we were concerned about in any racial differences, was that significantly more Black participants were exposed to thinking skills for work, computer cognitive training than whites. But when we controlled for sight, and we controlled for sight in all of our analyses because of the differences in the racial makeup and other aspects of the studies, for example, VR versus support employment. When we controlled for sight, there were no differences. So both racial groups were equally exposed to the computer cognitive training. And you can see here up to 19 to 24 sessions. And our goal is 24 unless a person gets a job, in which case, fine. We don't want to hold them back to finish the computer cognitive training. So you can see that 65% of our Black participants completed between 19 and 24 versus 62% of white participants. And then in terms of cognitive change, which was another one of our targets to evaluate in the study, we found that both Black and white participants improved equally and significantly in thinking skills for work. So in the orange bar depicts Black participants' baseline cognition and change at study end, or this is probably, study end, is much is significant compared to people in vocational rehabilitation only. And similarly, white participants improved significantly compared to vocational rehabilitation only. And there were no differences in degree of improvement between the two racial groups. This is another way to show you what I just showed on the bar graph. And these are the numbers. These are T-scores for cognitive performance on the cognitive battery. And this is shows you for Black Americans post cognitive composite T-score, which doesn't differ from white Americans, white participants in the study, and was much, the improvement was much greater compared to vocational rehabilitation alone. We also looked at average weeks worked, and you can see in the bar graph, the blue is average weeks worked for Black participants, and the orange is white participants in vocational rehabilitation only. And this is much less than weeks worked in thinking skills for work and vocational rehabilitation combined. And there was no effect of race or race by treatment group interaction. There is a main effect for treatment, meaning the combined intervention is superior to vocational rehabilitation alone. Similarly, for average wages in vocational rehabilitation only, the average wages are much less than the combined group because people are working more. And so there is an obvious main effect for treatment, but there's no effect for race or race by treatment group interaction. And then looking at percentage of people who obtain competitive employment, we also can see a primary main effect for treatment. But again, we did not find an effect for race or race by treatment group interaction. And again, for percentage of people who worked. So what did we just say? That Black participants in our studies had lower education levels, less work history, and were more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white participants. We also found that thinking skills for work equally benefited Black participants compared to white participants, despite the fact that Black participants had lower levels of education. What we also found is that thinking skills for work is sufficiently engaging and similarly cognitively and vocationally profitable to Black participants compared to white participants with serious mental illnesses. What I didn't mention, but I think is what we found is a really important point, and that is that is the following. So we found three really important and disturbing differences between Black and white participants. Less educational level, or less likelihood to have a high school diploma, more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and less likely to have a competitive work history. So we know that schizophrenia in general is associated with premature curtailment of educational attainment. So we know that people with schizophrenia have compromised education. That seems to be diagnostically specific. And we know that Black people in the United States in general have lower levels of education than white people. So in order to disentangle the contributions of race and diagnosis to educational level, we conducted a post hoc ANOVA to assess whether race or psychiatric diagnosis was predictive of educational level. And what we found is that race was a significant predictor of education above and beyond diagnosis. Race stands out as a very important predictor of education. So we concluded that systemic educational discrimination reduces employment and financial opportunities for Black Americans, and these disadvantages are present among Black persons with serious mental illnesses. And so to go back to the goal of doing this analysis, to compare racial groups in our studies, why did we're glad to see that people, irregardless of race, profited similarly. Why do we think so? Well, because like supported employment, our guiding principles for cognitive enhancement are that these services are individualized and individually tailored to the person's need for them. Our studies have always been inclusive, and we have worked with agencies that are highly inclusive and advocates of people with mental illnesses who have educational, social, financial disadvantages. And we have tended to include people who have a comorbid diagnosis of intellectual disability, who have had brain trauma, who may have active substance abuse. We have tended to be highly inclusive in our study enrollment. We have a strength-based approach. As I said, one of the topics for our cognitive self-management is helping people identify their strengths and knowing what they are. We also believe that repeated task practice, for example, in the computer cognitive training, will and does improve task performance. We focus on progress. We meet everybody where they're at in the beginning and do what we can. Cognitive specialists do what they can to help people improve. That is our goal. And we have chosen and have been extremely lucky to work with cognitive specialists who are advocates, who have experience in working with people with serious mental illness. That is their chosen profession, and have a desire to help people address cognitive issues in the service of the client's functional goals. We know that the cognitive specialist is really instrumental in enhancing motivation to try harder with the goal and the belief of improving, and encourages effort. And we know that putting out that effort will contribute to improvement in their performance. And this helps shape and reinforce work behaviors. And we know that cognitive self-management strategies are incredibly helpful at helping people work around difficulties, extend their cognitive skills, and help prioritize their day and their work tasks. So in addition to evaluating thinking skills for work in people with serious mental illness, we also have studies that involve scaling up thinking skills. We have studies in people with autism. We have studies focusing on people with primary diagnosis of intellectual disability. And along with Alexa Trolley-Hansen, we are developing an independent living skills curriculum, thinking skills for life, for people with mental illnesses. I just wanted to show our support from both NIMH and NIDLR, and also to acknowledge Chitrakare, who was our graduate student and is now an independent investigator doing great work in India in evaluating an adaptive model of supported employment for people with SMI. And she was instrumental in our work and thinking skills for work and developing our online course to provide distance learning training.
Thank you, Susan, for your really wonderful discussion. I would like to open the floor. Two questions now. Barry Waldner, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, you should be able to do that now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McGurk. An incredibly in-depth presentation. The
Yeah.
question I have is when I was seeing you hitting the dollar and cents points, did you take into account SSI and SSDI within the working? Because that's what I always find as a limiting point. And I find a lot of the white clients may have be on a program with a retired parent and be able to get a higher amount of release of funds. Therefore, they can work over the $2,000 limit. Actually, $1,470 per month, and that could be one of the limiting factors, I would believe. I'll be quiet and listen to your thoughts on that.
Barry, thank you. It's a great point. So we always collect information about income and insurance benefits. And nearly all of the clients that we have worked with at these agencies receive some combination of either SSI or SSDI. And because of that and concerns and real concerns about working to the point of losing these benefits, people generally hit a sweet spot of about 22 hours a week. This is what the developers of supported employment for SMI have learned, that full-time employment and going off these benefits is not always a goal of the participant. And most people want to maximize their income without losing their insurance benefits. And that seems to be about 22 hours. You bring up a really interesting point that you have seen white enrollees who have parents, they get SSDI through a retired parent, and there maybe the sky's the limit for what they can earn, and you're likely to see higher earnings. In the few people we enrolled who were not receiving insurance, we always see higher earnings. But for the most part, the people we have enrolled have these limitations because they receive these governmental benefits. Another point I want to make is just a famous researcher at the VA who has looked at amount of veterans' income and disability, and disability can be quite high. And he showed this almost linear relationship between income earned in a job and amount of entitlement payment, where the higher the entitlement, the less money someone's going to work for.
I don't know if I'm still on, but thank you.
Okay. Oh, you're welcome. No, thank you. It's an excellent point. And yes, we do collect that information and we do see the effect that you're reporting.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. If anyone else has a question, you can either type it into the chat box and I can ask it for you. You can raise your hand using the little raise hand indicator at the bottom, or you can just, there we go. So Kenneth, I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question. So go ahead.
I'm curious about whether or not this can be done remotely or has been done remotely during the pandemic.
Thank you for an incredibly timely question. So we have both trained people fully remotely to be cognitive specialists, and we also have delivered the intervention per necessity beginning in March 2020. And so, it's possible. Yes. So to train people remotely, that is very feasible. We have an online training course, and then we supplement that with supervision that can be done through Zoom or other web-based platforms. And we've done that in our scaling up project, and the PI of that project is Mary Ann Farkas, and we're actually finishing up our 6th year of that. And so that was very feasible. In terms of delivering remote services, and I'm guessing that this is more to the point of your question.
Yes.
So cognitive self-management strategies, highly feasible. So for example, here's one way it can be done. We have handouts, and these are for the client and the facilitator to use, a handout on each topic. So one way we did this when we were kind of scrambling in the beginning of COVID, the employment specialist could do, for example, a door drop of the handouts. And then if the client doesn't have a computer, which is not uncommon that people don't have a computer or internet access, we could do the session by phone. And that's what we did in one ongoing study when a pandemic occurred. Doing computer cognitive training is trickier because the client needs a computer. And so we supplied this. We supplied a relatively inexpensive tablet, taught the person how to use it if they hadn't already learned in the one project that was ongoing when we could no longer see people in person. So we did a door drop to deliver the laptop and then proceeded by phone to teach the person how to use the exercises and to coach them through the exercises. And so it is possible. The issue is the so-called technological divide, where our clients may not have internet, so Zoom becomes a hurdle. They may not have a computer or computer skills, and that people can obviously be taught to do that, to use the computer, to use the software, but it's harder to do that remotely. People would need to be given a computer with the software on it, and in some way, or it would be difficult to participate, or they could go to a facility or an agency or a library where they might have access to a computer. But cognitive self-management strategies are lower tech and can be done by phone if that's the technology that's available. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, the computer cognitive training poses a few more barriers because it's more resource intensive, requires software, a computer, and face-to-face meetings, either by Zoom, if possible, or typically in person.
Well, I know there's some software that's available for smartphones, Android or Apple, and I didn't know if that is something that might be usable.
What kind of software?
Yes, cognitive software for smartphones, a lot of apps.
Is that the name of a specific company?
No, it's just general terms that there's a lot of apps that deal with basically what they would call games to play that is available on smartphones. So I didn't know if that was something that was possible to use.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not using a phone app right now. We had one under development. Right now that's paused. But what you want to consider in all the cognitive software that's available on the phone, which of course would be incredibly convenient, or online, is the evidence. So you want to use a program that has demonstrated evidence to improve cognition in the people that, in the people that you're working with, or you want it to. So you want to keep an eye out for that. And if you ever have questions about a specific software or cognitive program, you can shoot me an email. I work with an international group of cognitive remediation researchers, and we're developing a website to help people understand what cognitive remediation is and where the evidence is, and what the evidence is, so people can make those informed decisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask? Again, you can raise your hand, or you can send me a chat post in the chat box. Want to make sure while we're letting people decide if they have a question, or taking a moment to formulate your idea into a question, I just want to call your attention. I did post a feedback survey in the chat. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this survey. So please, if you have a minute before you leave, we'd really appreciate it. It only takes a minute. Other questions? I don't see any other questions. Well, I do want to thank you so much for sharing your work with us, Dr. McGurk. And
Can I ask a question, Alexa?
sure.
There's one more, there's just like a few more minutes. If I could just ask the people who attended, and I'm really thrilled for your interest. If I was wondering if anyone wanted to tell us, about their interest in this really, really critical issue in our, in psychiatric rehabilitation, that the inequities and health disparities in treatment and mental health treatment.
So if you raise your hand, I can unmute you, or you can post in the chat box.
Well, I'm already here, so I'll let you know my interest is cognitive training, skills training related to competencies to stand trial for people with major mental illnesses.
Interesting. Wow.
So Kenneth, can I ask a follow-up question to that really fast?
Sure.
So are the competencies that you're looking at cognitive competencies, like looking at cognition and cognitive skills, or are there other competencies that you're also looking at?
Well, the basic competencies are whether or not you're psychiatrically stable, not using substances. The other part is what you talked about all this time is cognitive impairment, of being able to understand the legal process and to work with your for the defense. Those are issues that have to be addressed. Right now, they're being addressed by sending people to state hospital for an undetermined amount of time, up to 3 years, to acquire those conditions. There should be a diversion capability of doing it in the community. That would be both not only more economical, but a lot better for the defendants.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
I did an internship at Patton State Hospital. I don't know if you know hospitals in the West Coast, but this was years ago. They had, they were charged with competency issues. So I'm familiar with what you're saying. I'm wondering if you had any kind of observations about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues for that group.
Well, I'm in Minnesota, so we have a lot of diversity. And there's a lot of issues, an awful lot of issues. But the standard treatment is medication, sometimes injectable. And the other option that goes along with that is groups where you basically go over what happens in court. And like I said, they can do that for up to 3 years.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Katrina, would you like to share what you put in the chat?
Hi everybody, I'm Katrina. I'm here in New Zealand. It's very early in the morning. I'm doing my doctorate research on the implementation of cognitive remediation therapy into a vocational rehab service, and I think the manager of that service might also be on the webinar somewhere. So hi Jenny, if you are. I just I'm finding this really interesting of I'm interviewing managers and leaders, therapists and service users to gain the experience of a cognitive remediation therapy program and how it's been implemented. And just of the 4 service users that have taken part in my research, 3 of them are Māori. So I was really interested in your presentation, being the difference between black and white participants in your studies, because they are highly represented. And so one of the things I'm spending time with is with commercial is our Māori leaders to get a cultural perspective on their experiences. So I'm working through that at the moment. Yeah, it's interesting.
Thank you, Marnie.
You're so welcome.
Katrina, thank you. But well, now Marnie, would you like to add?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's so
Wrong.
hard.
Confusion reigns, we all get wet.
Well, and you know what? It's
Thank
really
you,
hard. in
Katrina.
this. Marnie, would you like to share what your thoughts were?
Well, I have so little background in SMI. I'm a late in life MSW student, and my interest is in being able to help folks who end up or find themselves in suicidal spaces. And I signed up because this is, we think that when we're in graduate programs, of course, of any kind, we can take everything in. Well, the fact of the matter is you cannot take everything in by any means. And when a small chance comes to get a little bit of knowledge, I realized I need to reach out and broaden my knowledge in areas like this. So this is really valuable for me.
That's wonderful, Marnie, and I'm so glad you joined. And if you want any particular resources, or if anyone does, I'm happy to provide them the slides or other information. Just let us know what you would like, and
Great.
we'll see what we can send.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.